Almighty God bless you, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit.
Praise be Jesus Christ our King.
Thank you. How are you? Good morning. Good morning. Yeah, you too here. Are you?
So it's a typical Sunday morning. I'm leaving Mass with my wife and my kids, and as everyone's exiting the pews and going for bulletins and coffee and donuts, and the priest is shaking hands and kissing babies and blessing people, we walk out, and before we hit the back door, the priest, who's a friend, he stops my family, and he says hello to everybody, gives a couple blessings, and looks at my 6-year-old daughter, and he says, "Sweetheart, how was Mass for you today?" And she looks right back at Father, grins big, and she says, "Father, that was so boring. I mean, really, really boring." And then she smiles. And then he looks up at me and looks down at her and looks back at me. And I said, I mean, who says this? Who looks at a priest after Mass and says how boring it is? You know who says that? Kids say that. Because kids are honest. Because kids say things that adults are afraid to say. And I gotta admit, when I was her age and as I was growing up, I didn't find Mass that exciting. I mean, even when I was interactive at Mass, even when I would wait for my brother to move his foot underneath the kneeler so I could smash it when he wasn't looking, or even when the collection basket would come by and I'd have that moral dilemma, should I take money out of it? Maybe no one's looking, maybe I can get away with it. But as I was growing up, I always went to Mass. I was an altar boy. I paid attention when I was an altar boy. It was great being an altar boy. So here I am in the sanctuary and I'm sitting up in my little altar boy chair, and I remember a Mass literally during the second reading, the Monsignor, the priest saying Mass, he fell asleep. And I'm thinking to myself, I'm the closest one to him. Should I wake him up? Should I use the bells to wake him up? I mean, Mass was exciting because it was sort of interactive at that age. But the older I got, the more I started to look around and say, I don't understand these readings. And I'm not even sure that lector pronounced the thing the right way. I don't think that lector pronounced that city the right way at all. And I'm not really into this music. And from what I can tell, that person should not be singing because they can't hit that note that they're trying to hit and they're asking me to hit. And I would try to pay attention during the homily, but sometimes that train of thought would just go right off the rails. I mean, that train of thought would be in a different station than the one I was in. So literally, as I was growing up, Mass was not enjoyable for me, but I was never allowed to say it. I was never allowed to say that Mass was, boring. But I was sitting there at 15, 16 years old, and I was wondering, are there just a bunch of old guys in Rome with big hats who are wringing their hands saying, how can we make 1 billion Catholics' lives miserable every Sunday morning? And why, I would think to myself, why would God command that we keep holy the Sabbath? Why would God command? Why would the church say it's a mortal sin to miss Mass? I mean, have they not actually been to Mass? These were the questions that would roll through my head. Now, what is the point of all this? You're saying, I'm here to learn about the Mass, and you're telling me everything that's wrong with it. This is my perspective. Maybe you've never had this experience of Mass before. Or maybe you have. Maybe you've sat back and wondered, why would God command us to go to church to keep holy the Sabbath? What is the Sabbath? Why would God make us go through this? Is this because God wants us to be miserable? Or is there something deeper? He calls us to sacrifice. He calls us to worship because we need it. Not because he does. It's really pretty simple, actually. It's a meal. It's a meal with our family, our brothers and sisters, with our Father. When God wants to tell us something, God wants to speak to us, God wants to feed us. Like any good family, we eat together. But you might say to yourself, what about all the extra stuff? What about all the smells and the bells, all the candles and the robes and the stained glass, and why all that stuff? Why do we worship this way? Because we're stepping out of our world and into his for that hour at Mass. It's not so much God coming down as it is him lifting us up. The problem is not with God. The problem is with us. Because you know what? It's more than it seems. It's more than meets the eye. If you were like me, you didn't learn about the Mass a lot growing up. You were expected to be there, but you didn't really understand it. And when we really understand the Mass, things come to life in a new way. When we learn a few things about why we use this, why we say this, why we do this at this time, the Mass is no longer boring. The Mass actually is incredible. It's captivating. We just have to know a little bit more about what's going on. Because to be a Catholic means you look past what you see on the surface. To be a Catholic means you understand there's a deeper reality. There's mystical realities. It's that when we go to Mass, it's not just about history. It's about mystery. Because as Catholics, things are not always what they seem.